It's, I think, a little bit less about what happens in the moment and more about what you're bringing to the table in the moment. But I think starting from that kind of unconditional acceptance of your child, taking a really deep breath and just reminding yourself, I'm not going to take this personally because it's not personal, and I get the chance to be the adult here. I get the chance maybe to be the adult that I needed when I felt like this. From that point then, I think then you're focusing on the moment.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews, inspiring special guest stories, and parents sharing their real life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking about ADHD and explosive behaviours with our expert guest, Sarah Ockwell-Smith. Sarah is a well-known parenting expert and author who writes about the psychology and science of parenting. Sarah specialises in gentle parenting, a movement she is often credited as founding, and childism, which is the unconscious discrimination of children in society. Sarah has written 16 books, the newest of which, Raising Attention, is a compassionate, evidence-informed and deeply personal guide for anybody who has or works with children with ADHD and explosive behaviours, including parents, carers, teachers and healthcare professionals. It busts commonly believed myths surrounding ADHD, discusses up-to-date neuroscience and genetics research in an accessible way, along with providing practical tips that really make a difference to both children and the adults who care for them. Raising Attention champions respect, empathy and understanding over control, discipline and shame. Sarah is the mother of 4 young adults, including a son with ADHD. She has ADHD and autism herself. Welcome aboard, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's begin by asking the big question, what is explosive behaviour and how does it relate to ADHD?
Gosh, so if I give you a little bit of backstory, I basically had lots of people asking me, is it possible to gently parent children who aren't inherently gentle? And I was like, okay, what do you mean by that? I think I know what you mean by that, but what do you mean a child who isn't gentle? And I think what people mean there is children who aren't obedient, children who aren't controllable, children who have behaviour that's a bit more over the top, a bit more severe than the average child or you might expect. And then you also have lots of people will mention the words violence. So violent outbursts verbally. So lots of shouting, lots of swearing, lots of name calling, or violence physically. So that could be anything from slamming doors, throwing objects, kicking things, lashing out at you, objects, people, something else. But I think for me, explosive behaviour is behaviour that's a little bit beyond what most people think that they should expect to cope with children, and behaviour that is not easily able to be calmed down. And it's not, so I know my book talks about ADHD, but it's not just with children with ADHD. Not all children with ADHD have explosive behaviour, and I don't want to make a stereotype that they do. But the book is for people with children who don't have a diagnosis, children who have parents who have neurotypical children whose behaviour errs on the side of explosiveness. I think personally, having been there with 4 children, I found that the hardest behaviour to cope with, particularly when we were out in public or it happened at school and I was called in to talk about it. And I've just been asked to write about this for so long, but I really couldn't because I was still trying to work through it myself.
I think it's much needed, isn't it? And I was thinking back, you said, obviously, it's not something that all children with ADHD have. And I guess also, even for children with ADHD who maybe do present explosive behaviours, it's not necessarily the case that it's there all the time. You said door slamming, and immediately it reminded me of the massive crack that appeared down the wall by my kitchen door from the number of times it was slammed when my kids were younger. So I guess it can show in many ways. And I really liked what you said there too about that it's behaviour that's not controllable, because I think that's such a great way of summing it up, particularly when we think about certain contexts like school. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the word naughty, because I really hate that word. And yet it is a label that so many people jump straight to in response to these behaviours. So why do you believe that the word naughty, the term naughty, is so harmful for neurodivergent children?
I mean, I think it's harmful for any children, but particularly for neurodivergent for a few reasons. I think if we come at it from a parental point of view, I'm sure lots of your listeners will have been in the position where they have either been directly blamed for their child's behaviour or have thought that they were being indirectly blamed for it. So they've been made to feel like they're doing something wrong if they're in a meeting at school because their child is behaving in this way because they've raised them in that way. They're not doing a good enough job at discipline. From the child's perspective, giving them this label is harmful in so many ways. So it really impacts their self-esteem. And in the book, I talk about what I call the cycle of shame. So when a child feels useless and shamed and punished, their self-esteem, their self-confidence drops, and then they find it harder to control their behaviour. So then you get even more explosive or naughty behaviour. And then there's more shame, more punishment, more lowered self-esteem. And I think children, particularly with ADHD, their confidence and their esteem are just at rock bottom. And every time we label them naughty, we are basically saying, we think that you should be in control of your behaviour, but for some reason you have chosen not to be. So you are the problem and your parents are the problem as well. And I think it's really deeply unhelpful because it brushes aside any issues, any underlying problems. If the child is labelled naughty because they've chosen to behave that way and the parents have raised them in that way, then that absolves responsibility from, say, the school for thinking, actually, maybe are we not meeting this child's needs? Are we putting them in situations that they are never going to succeed in? Is something happening here that's making this child's life really difficult? And that not necessarily just at home, at school, that could be at home too and in other settings. So I think it's a really lazy label that is really harmful for so many different reasons.
Yeah, because it's not looking at the big picture, is
No.
it? And I very much believe that, and I say this all the time, that all behaviour is communication, So when children are behaving in a way that somebody wants to label as naughty, depending on the context and the environment, then, as you say, it fails to address what's really going on. So why do you think it's so important to kind of reframe that narrative and understand what's underneath the behaviour?
Yeah, do you know, I really actually don't like the term all behaviour is communication. I think it can be very easily attacked
Oh,
by people. And
interesting.
it is very, if you go on to Twitter or X now and look up Edu Twitter and you look at people like Tom Bennett's followers and constantly ridiculing the idea that all behaviour is communication, because sometimes it isn't. A lot of behaviour is simply just brain development. It's not even a child trying to communicate anything, it just is. So all behaviour has a reason, that would be my phrase, but I don't think it is always communication. And I think if we say all behaviour is communication, then we still try to fix it all of the time. We still try and think, well, what are they communicating? And that puts you in a really difficult position as a parent or a carer when you can't find the reason. And then that makes you think you've failed or, what is my child trying to communicate? And I think everybody can get a bit confused and a bit exhausted then. And I'm really sorry, but I can't remember your question.
No, not at all. I mean, firstly, to say thank you for saying that, because I think that is quite enlightening for me too, that it adds a completely different perspective, because you're so right. There's been many times where I'm trying to figure out off the back of a behaviour what's going on here. And actually, to take your point, there isn't always something going on. It can be developmental and it can just be because. But the question itself is, why do you think it's important to understand what's underneath the behaviour?
Okay, so because otherwise you'll never resolve it, will you? I mean, all you will end up doing is palliating it, hiding it, forcing the child to mask. You're never actually resolving any of the issues. You're never working with the child. You're never actually truly helping them. And I think as a parent, as somebody who's had 4 children and struggled hugely with them, the ideal of resolving the issues and having compliant, obedient children is a really enticing one. When you're exhausted and shattered and you just want everybody to comply, And it would be really nice to have like all four little children lined up saying, yes, mummy, okay, mummy, yes, mummy, we'll do that, and being really good. But when we think of what we're really doing, which is we're not trying to raise easy, compliant children, we're trying to raise individuals, adults who are whole and happy and emotionally well developed, and who basically don't have to have therapy to recover from our parenting of them. And when you think of it from that point of view, you think, well, I need to really know what's going on here, and I need to try and help them with that, because this isn't just about making life easier for me. It's about making life good for them. And there's a big clash there. And that's like the really difficult dichotomy of parenting, is what's easy for us is usually not best for them. And what's best for them is normally not easy for us.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Never really considered it from that perspective before. And that makes me think about something that I talk about as an ADHD coach, and that is that it's not that children won't, but rather that they can't, because we,
Mm-hmm.
as parents, we have to be able to almost stand back and understand this from a different perspective. So why do you think that is important?
I do think in most times it's that they can't. I think we are kidding ourselves if sometimes we say that children won't do something because they just don't want to. So I think, again, we have to be careful. They're really nice phrases to remember. All behaviour is communication, won't, not can't. But I don't think they're always correct. So sometimes children just don't want to do something. They could, but they don't want to do it, just like adults. But I do think in most cases, when we're talking explosive or implosive or out of control behaviour, then we are definitely in a can't situation. And when children can't do what we're asking of them, and we're pushing them to do it, it's going to end badly for everybody. So from our perspective, it's not going to make our life easy or have compliant obedient children in the present. They are going to be pushed to the level that we're basically pushing all those big emotions down the line for an enormous explosion or an enormous implosion. And from their point of view, again, we're not seeing the fact that they need more support, or they need more understanding, or they need reasonable adjustments and blah, 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 because there's this constant pressure on them. You can change, you just don't have the desire to. And I think that's where school discipline comes in, which always centres on carrots and sticks. So the presumption of naughty behaviour at school, whatever age, whether you've got a 5-year-old or an 18-year-old in sixth form, is that the child is not doing something because they don't want to, and they're just unmotivated. So what we can do if we want them to behave better is we can either dangle a promise of a reward. So that could be a head teacher certificate. That could be moving to the smiley faces on the clouds or the traffic light system. It could be going to have a hot chocolate with the headmaster. It could be, having an end of term class reward or dojo points or whatever it is. Or on the flip side, let's make them feel bad and punish them when they don't behave in the desired way. And that could be, if we're talking younger child, missing 10 minutes of golden time or break time. It could be being sent into the corridor. For older children, it's usually detention or isolation. And you see the same children again and again and again and again in these, which should be a really massive warning sign that they don't work, right? It's so
Absolutely.
obvious if you've got the same kid in lunchtime detention every day, and then every week or so that child is in isolation, which was my child. And these were the arguments I had with the school. This is not working because he is literally in detention more than he is having playtime. This is when he was at secondary school. And that lunch break, that time with his peers, and to be outside and to kick a ball around, that is so important for him to offload, to
Absolutely.
calm down. But you are putting him in this room, making him write lines, read a book, sit still, all of which are really hard for him, because you think he's chosen to behave like this. But the fact that his behaviour is not changing, in actual fact, it's getting worse, surely that's a sign that he hasn't chosen this. So what can you do to help him to change his behaviour with the understanding that maybe it's not a motivational issue?
Mm.
And I think whether that's at home, whether we are using time out, the naughty step, consequences, you can't go to the park this weekend, the Easter Bunny's not going to visit, Santa's not going to bring you a present, all these threats that we hang over children's heads, I think we really need to take a step back and think, is this a motivation issue? If it is, then maybe a quick bit of motivating or demotivating might help. But usually it isn't a motivation issue. And in which case, these punishments and these rewards are just going to be ineffective, because, as you said, it's not a case that they don't want to do it. Because it was really interesting with the book. I interviewed my son, who's now 21, and said, tell me how you were feeling in these moments. And he said, I just wasn't in control. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew what I should be doing. I didn't want to do it, but I just had no control. I was like in a sports car with no brake, and like somebody had put my foot and tied it with a brick to the accelerator. I couldn't not do it. It was like something took control, but that's not a motivation issue. So yes, in that instance, can't, not, won't, absolutely, but not always. There were definitely times when he could, but he just wouldn't. And I think we have to be really careful to not say all behaviours can't, not, won't.
Yeah, and it's a good distinction, isn't it? That is it a motivation issue or is it not? And when it's not a motivation issue, then the carrot and stick examples that you're giving there they become counterintuitive. So in terms of then those moments when our children are struggling to self-regulate, how do we respond to their behaviour in that moment? Like, how does it kind of start with us as parents and at home? How can we become a useful tool in their toolbox, if that's a kind of right way of explaining it?
There are no magic solutions. There is nobody that you could interview that would give you a perfect answer to this, or a way to magically fix things. So I would start by saying you can only do your best. And for parents of neurodivergent children, you're probably really running on empty. I'm sure you'll talk about this later, but there's a really high chance you're neurodivergent yourself, which is an extra struggle. And the pressures of parenting in today's society are immense. So I think we have to start with firstly saying, we'll give ourselves grace. You're probably going to screw up. You probably won't do it perfectly. And that's okay as long as you're trying. But I think we have to rewind a lot, and it starts well before those moments when your child has a meltdown or an explosion, which is, I think, first of all, we have to understand our children and understand what's going on in their brain, understand their ability, understand their capabilities, understand their triggers, understand their early warning signs, and if possible, not get to that point. What can I avoid to not reach this level? And I think a lot of people would say to me, well, that's ridiculous. You're just avoiding discipline. That's permissive parenting. And I'm like, you know what? No, that's smart parenting, because the best parenting, gentle parenting, isn't always about discipline. It's about understanding and knowledge and tweaking your parenting for your child's individual needs. So it has to start there. It also has to start with understanding what's going on for us. Because to be honest, 90% of what we do is about how we do it and how we're feeling. So there's an awful lot of unpacking for us to do about how we were treated as children when we were naughty, how our parents, how our carers were towards us, what unconsciously comes out of our mouths, what discipline methods we subconsciously tend to use because that's what we've picked up on Instagram or social media or the health visitor or the school or our mum or whoever else. So it's, I think, a little bit less about what happens in the moment and more about what you're bringing to the table in the moment. But I think starting from that kind of unconditional acceptance of your child, taking a really deep breath and just reminding yourself, I'm not going to take this personally because it's not personal, and I get the chance to be the adult here. I get the chance maybe to be the adult that I needed when I felt like this. From that point, then I think then you're focusing on the moment. And for me, it always starts with safety. So I'm not worried about what type of parenting I'm doing if there is a risk there. So I will move my child away from the risk away from my child. If they're going to hurt somebody else, I would be moving them away. Safety, obviously, at that moment trumps everything. When you're safe, I think then it's a case of, you know your child best. There's nothing I can tell you here that you don't already know. What is it that helps your child to calm down? Is it giving them space and going to a different room? Is it sitting with them? Is it putting some music on? Is it giving them more sensory input, less sensory input? Whatever it is that your child needs, there's no point asking them in that moment, because the fight or flight mode and the cortisol, the red mist, they are just, it's more that they can't hear you, more for them to process and take on. So it's like a trial and error process of what works for them in that moment. And then afterwards, and everybody's calm, it's about the reconnecting. And for you as the adult, what can you learn from that situation? What didn't go quite so well? What triggered that? Is there a new trigger? Is there something that you need to learn from it? and then having a chat with the child afterwards. And I think just really importantly, being on the child's side and letting them know that you are on their side. And if you had to shout at them or move them quickly and you hurt them, then make sure you apologise, explain why you did it and say, I'm really sorry. And then talk through if there was anything that you could have done differently, get feedback from them. And then think about, is there something you can put into place next time to make things easier? And it is a massive trial and error process. It's not quick. It's not easy. I'll never make for a nice soundbite on social media for that, because it's not a 60-minute, when your child does this, do this, and everything will be perfect, because there's no answer there.
I think it's useful, though, to hear that, because I think sometimes we forget that this is a gradual and continual process that we make, probably
and exhausting, gradual
micro steps forward. Exhausting, yeah, exactly. But we are making these, even if they're tiny incremental steps forward, we are collectively compounding this in a positive sense every time by going through that process. And you gave some examples of things to do there, but I'm just thinking about, let's say you're not at home in that home environment and you're out and about, because I know some of my worst moments managing these sorts of situations when my children were younger was when I was in public, and it was absolutely triggered by my own fear of judgment of others, not for myself, but for my children. So when we're out in public like that and we feel like the world around us isn't very calm, like what helps? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about some of my moments like that in the book, and I'm just recalling there was a moment when we'd gone for a day out to central London to see the sights with my children, and my son was just like, I don't want to be doing this today. And just in Trafalgar Square at the edge of it, we had, I think, maybe the biggest meltdown he's ever had. And in that moment, I was like, oh my goodness, everybody's watching me. I felt such pressure to try and stop him and to act like this perfect parent. And, in reality, maybe people were watching. Far fewer people than I would imagine were actually watching. I would hope some people were watching and feeling a little bit of empathy for us and thinking, I remember those days, they were tough. And maybe there were a few people tutting and saying, oh, the kids today, they're out of control. But to be honest, those people really aren't worthy of your time and headspace of worrying about them. They're just not particularly nice people. If you're the sort of person to be out on the street judging a parent in public for a child having a meltdown, then you are just not a nice person and you're just not worth worrying about. So I think in that moment in time, if it could have gone, I don't know what it did. I don't remember. I just remember feeling immense shame, stress, worry, anxiety, all of these emotions all together, which is probably what also my son was feeling too. If I could go back and coach myself through it, the first thing I'd say is take a breath and try and shut out everybody else. These are strangers. You won't see them again. It doesn't matter. And just imagine surrounding yourself with a little bubble and focusing only on that. And then it would be exactly the same thing. First of all, safety. Are you near a road? Well, then you've got to try and get out of the road into a quieter, calmer place that's safer. And then, when my son had complete breakdowns like that, there wasn't anything that you could do to shorten them. You just had to kind of be near him and make sure that he was safe and other people when you were safe, and wait for it to finish effectively. And then at that point, it would be asking a question. I think probably what we should have done then is gone home rather than try to, not gone home as a punishment. That's really important. But to just say, look, I think this is just, everything's a little bit overwhelming. Shall we go home, or shall we go somewhere quiet? Because I thought this would be a really fun thing, but I'm not so sure that you're coping so well with it, rather than we're going home now, you've been naughty. And then again, just the kind of talking it through, reconnecting afterwards. But there genuinely was, in those moments, there was nothing I could have done to have shortened it. It's like it had to play out in a certain way at a certain length of time, and then we could patch the pieces up afterwards. And I think I didn't understand that at the time. I think I felt like a failure with my inability to stop his meltdowns. If I see people now on Instagram or TikTok doing, when your child has a meltdown, which there's a differentiation, isn't there, between a meltdown with a neurodivergent child or a meltdown as we use it for a toddler. And I think sometimes that word is used interchangeably, which is not particularly helpful. But the advice you see in a nice 60-second reel will be saying, now do this breathing, and then everything's lovely, and say these words. And I'm just thinking they just wouldn't work. That would make things worse. And just, I think the knowledge of that you're not failing and here's not a problem just because you can't stop it in 60 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. And these things are very useful tools in the background as a general regulation approach and things that we can practice. But in that moment, they're inaccessible, right? Because we're not in this rational thinking part
Totally.
of our brain. And you mentioned there about the repair and reconnection. And I think it's in those moments when, you know, the emotion has settled and you have that ability wherever you are to you know, to repair and reconnect with your child. And I've absolutely focused on that, you know, because we're human, aren't we? We get it wrong. Sometimes we shout, sometimes we react, sometimes we know we could have done better, sometimes we're worried about other people. But it's always been really important to me to recognize that with my kids so that they can see that in that moment that it's not just them that was struggling and that you're part of that process too.
And I think sometimes as well, you need maybe some downtime and some time away from them, because I think it's too easy in those moments to take it personally, think, why are you doing this to me again? Why are you embarrassing me? You're doing this on purpose. You're doing this to be naughty, to wind me up, because we're dealing with a lot as adults, as parents. We're trying desperately to parent in this new informed way, but all of our baggage, our wiring is telling us to do it the old way. And the old way is always that kids are always wrong, adults are always right. Children should always respect adults. Adults don't need to respect children so much. It should always go the other way. You know, obedience is good, compliance is good. If a child isn't obedient, compliant, then we need to punish them. There should be consequences. There should be discipline. So you've got this almost like this inner war going on in your head of this is what you should be doing, but I want to do it differently. And sometimes I think you just need a step away to just go, do you know what? I'm really trying my best here. That wasn't perfect by any means, and I said and did things that I'm probably going to be ashamed of, but I'm doing it a hell of a lot better than maybe how somebody did it in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And just give yourself a little bit of grace for that before having to instantly rush in and apologise to your child. It's almost like you need to apologise to yourself first for your sort of self-criticism and judgment of yourself.
Yeah, that bit I'm not very good at.
Because otherwise you find yourself like, there would be nights that I would just sit and feel so awful, of like torn between I was a failure, why was my child like this, but also I was a monster, why was I like that to my child? And I think you have to get out of that cycle yourself to really make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on then, in fact, you mentioned earlier as well, in regards to the role of schools in that picture. You know, we can be doing this work at home, but many schools don't understand or fully support these emotional needs. So, from that perspective, what do you wish schools understand, and what do you think needs to change in response to children with these big explosive behaviours?
I think it's not necessarily the understanding. I think there are plenty of schools, if we're talking as a body, I think the individual teachers who understand. There are many teachers who understand and would like to do things differently. There are definitely teachers who don't understand and who need better training and who have a lot of stereotypes and biases in their head and opinions that are very ill-informed. Don't get me wrong, they definitely exist. But I think there are a lot of really good teachers, and I want to make it clear, if I criticise the education system, I'm criticising the system and not the people who work within it. I say in my book, my son is a secondary school teacher, and very often you'll find that the teachers will want to do things differently, but they can't, because they've got a class of 30 children or 32 children, and they can't have that one-to-one time with that individual child when they've got 29 children that they have to get through this syllabus because they've got GCSEs in 6 months or SATs or something else, or they've got somebody from Ofsted watching them, or, you know, there's this intense pressure on them that what do you do? They know, I think, that these children are being let down, but they're not enough time, there's not enough people, there's not enough staff, there's not enough funding for them to do what they really know that they need to do. And I do believe at least half of teachers know what they're doing isn't great, but there's just, you know, I'll often have conversations with my son and he'll say, Mum, I don't want to do this, but realistically, what can I do? What else can I do? And I think it has to come back from, if you want real change, there has to be complete educational reform, not just send reform, but total educational reform. That schools, the way they're set up now, are not good for any children. Not just neurodivergent children. They're not meeting the needs of any children. It's set up, for capitalism, for neoliberalism, not for the needs of children. The whole Ofsted and SATs and exams and the work now, for instance, they're doing at GCSE used to be the work that I did at A-level. It's absolutely stupid, the amount of stuff that they keep adding into the syllabuses, and then they're constantly changing. And it's really hard to meet a child's needs. So they're in this really horrible position of, well, what do we do? Because we've got 29 other children in this class, and then we've got this one child, and we have to try and balance needs. And in that trying to balance the needs, they actually don't really meet anybody's needs. And there's a lot of indirect, and I would also say direct discrimination happening. But I like to be positive and think that it's not on purpose. And that actually most teachers, they don't get paid a lot of money. There's a lot of stress in the job. I don't think they're in it for the money or the power trip. I think most of them are in it because they love education. They love teaching children. They love nurturing children. So what would I do that's different? I mean, change has to come from a governmental level, from a structural level. I've got a whole chapter in the book talking about what I would do different. There were, really basic small things, like when my son trained as a teacher, he trained at an Oxbridge college, one of the best in the UK, and he didn't really have any training on special educational needs or neurodivergence. They had, I think it was a couple of days that they could pick a workshop, and there was an hour on ADHD, but it was voluntarily that he intended it. He didn't have to go to it. So I think I would start that there would have to be proper training on neurodivergence for all teachers as part of the process, that was not just an hour or a day. It was properly in depth, and also more knowledge of child development and brain development and stuff like that. Like I would like to see a 6-month module added into the PGCE, or training the early teacher years. From like on a more basic level in the school, having like a mentor system would be really good. So having, if you have, say, a year 7 with ADHD, finding a year 13 with ADHD, same type of ADHD. So my son, they found him a mentor. He was in year 11 and they set him up. He had combined type, but was very explosive. And they set him up with a girl who was not remotely kind of externally hyperactive. It was just sort of, she was very much like the classic girl, the daydreamer, the sort of scattered thoughts, but didn't struggle with regulating her external behaviour. So that didn't really help him, because although they had the same condition, their experiences of it were very, very different. So having a mentor where they are very closely matched, I think is a great thing, not just for the younger children, but for the older ones too. I'd really like to see more staff talk, so staff who have conditions like ADHD or something else giving assemblies, so that the whole school are aware of it, so that the other children don't see them as the difficult one, the naughty one, that the other children actually have ways that they can help them, rather than being ostracised and, ridiculed and stuff like that. But I think almost everything I recommend will come back to that understanding and that kind of fostering community and belonging and respect, stuff like that. I think it would be really good if all schools had a place that these children could go to if they were overstimulated without having questions asked. So if there was a room that they could just say, or hold up a card and just, I'm going to have time out in this room now, I'm really struggling now. Simple things like not expecting them to carry their books around for different lessons and keeping the books in the lessons so that they don't have to do that organising, and not giving them detention for things that are direct symptoms of their ADHD.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's a lot of things. I'm not a teacher, I'm not a specialist in education, but there are a lot of straightforward things I think that schools could implement, some easily, some not so easily, that could make a real difference.
Absolutely. And, in addition to not overloading executive function, as you mentioned, and the whole education piece around peers and other children, as well as kind of teachers and the staff within the school, I think there's a real importance in sort of celebrating and understanding strengths and successes and achievements, when perhaps in moments people do make a different choice, even if not immediately, even if the impulse is still there and they act on the impulse, but actually they're then able to, the way in which they take action after that, perhaps there's a change there.
Well, and allowing them to do stuff that fits their strengths, not trying to force them into a curriculum that's, you've got to do this, and this, when actually, you would be a great artist, you would be a great bricklayer, you would be a great musician. How can we change the syllabus so you can have more time doing what you thrive at doing and less time doing what you really struggle with?
Yeah, absolutely. Because all of those things, as you talked earlier about that sort of negative downward spiral, it has the opposite effect, doesn't it? And it starts to build children up, and we start to positively reinforce their strengths, and then they start to feel better about themselves. And then that has a knock-on effect in terms of conduct and behaviour. And you talk a lot about finding glimmers on hard days, which I think applies both in a school setting and at home, and I love that. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means and why it matters?
Yeah, it's just like small specks of hope or glimmers of light on those really dark days when you're really struggling with something, when your child is really struggling as well, and just one little thing that they might do or say, rather than focusing on the bigger picture. Today has been awful because they've done X, Y, and Z. But then also they just, my son was so sweet. If we were out in public, he would often disappear and you'd think, oh gosh, where's he gone? But he would never run off. He was never like a run off and whatever. He would always be helping somebody. So we would turn around and be like, where's he gone? And he'd be picking up something an old lady had dropped on the floor. And those moments, to really kind of store them in your memory bank and think, okay, so we have had the most horrendous day, but then you also did that. You have the ability at the end of the day to focus on one of them, and to be able to focus on that one was just so sweet and so kind and so respectful. And that's what I'm raising him to be. That glimmer and that sort of like shot into the future of who he is underneath everything is the one to really focus on. And to kind of, it's really too easy, I think, to store all the negative moments and the self-doubts and the questioning. And we tend to overlook these glimmers. But focusing on them makes such a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that even leans into what you said earlier in terms of a lot of these tools are not useful in the moment of dysregulation, but they do have a compounding positive effect if we zoom out and look at the big picture a little bit. And I'm really aware of focusing on those glimmers, as you say, at the moment with my children. Like it's very easy because we're exhausted and we're in the trenches every day with this stuff, to actually lose sight of the progress and the changes and the positive. And really every day I'm trying to notice these small, tiny, maybe even quite nuanced things, and just think, actually, that's different, that's progress, and focus on that as a way of kind of helping us move forward. So what final message would you like to leave parents listening who are struggling with their children's explosive behaviours, to help them feel less alone on this journey?
Gosh, I think the message I'd probably give is what I asked my son when I was writing the book. If you just give them one message, what would you tell to parents and teachers reading this? And he just said, I think you have to really accept them as they are and not try to change them. So it's that sort of unconditional acceptance of not trying to mold your child to be like other children, whether that's your own other children or other children in their class or in your family, and realize that you do have this lovely, unique individual, and it's maybe not what you thought you were signing up for or what you expected. But rather than trying to change them, just completely accepting them and working with them, not against them, is, it's really powerful. It took me a heck of a long time to get there. And it was just, I found it really telling that it took me, the journey with my son started, I realised when he was 3, he's 21 now. And I would say it probably took me till he was sort of 15 or 16 to really be on board with that sort of message. And it just really struck me that I just said, tell me one thing. And he came straight out with it. I'm like, wow, I wish I had that insight 2 decades ago. And just really, again, they are not doing it deliberately to give you a hard time. They are really struggling in a world that was not designed for them, that discriminates against them daily, that ridicules them. And really, I think, as cheesy as it sounds, it just comes back to love and support and belonging.
And it's such a powerful message, isn't it? And it's, as you say, that was just something that was immediate for your son. And I think
Yeah.
it's creating that environment at home, which, as you say, does take time, because there's a lot we have to process as parents there may be initial grief in there, coming to terms with things, learning to adjust.
So I had constantly professionals telling me there was nothing wrong with him, that he didn't have ADHD, he was just immature, and it was my parenting. So yeah, I think a lot, just the sort of the journey to getting a diagnosis and the validation it can give for the child and for the parents is a big one. But the society we are in is just really against parents and children, all parents, all children, but particularly those who are neurodivergent. I'm just giving this off the grace and realising, okay, all right, it is really hard, because it is hard, not because I suck or there's something wrong with my child.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of fighting almost a whole system in that sense, not just educationally, but at societal level, as you say, the way in which children are viewed and seen and the expectations, and realising that, that's not how you feel and that you want to do it differently, and knowing that that isn't perhaps as easy as it sounds, but being able to do that at home and create that environment there, even if it takes time, so that your children are absolutely kind of loved and accepted as they are. I think it's a continual process, but one that I'm absolutely aware of, when all these expectations and demands are put on them in all the different settings that they exist within, to be able to come home and be safe, to decompress and to be loved unconditionally in that environment is such an important one.
And I would really also quickly say, I know we spoke about school, but school is really not a great place for all children with ADHD. And I don't want it to come across as I'm saying all children with ADHD should go to school, because I think a lot of them really shouldn't. If there's a possibility to take them out of that system until that system is more fit for their needs, and educate them at home, then I would. I asked my son numerous times, what do you want to be? And he wanted to be at school. But sometimes there are systems we can leave, and the education system is one of them. The societal system as a whole, we have to still battle with. But sometimes if you can leave that system and that's easier, then absolutely I would go for it.
Yeah, I often think now, my son's 14, just finishing year 9. And I think had I known maybe everything that I know now when he was much younger, would I have done things differently? So I think that's really important for parents listening to hear that, because sometimes we're seeking permission, aren't we, as we're trying to find our way in the dark with all of this stuff. So I think that's probably quite an empowering message.
But asking the child as well. We don't ask them enough. They know. If you have a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, they know whether they would prefer to be at home or at school. I don't think it's a decision that we should make. I talk about the medication decision. That's not just a decision for us as adults. That's their decision with our support, as is the education one. And I just think we have to be really careful to allow them to make that decision, rather than step in and think, I'm the adult, I have to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly as children are getting older, to feel that they are playing an active and constructive role, I guess, in shaping their lives and the environments within which they exist. You're absolutely right on that. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. And we will link through to your exciting new book, Raising Attention, in the show notes below.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you, Sarah. If you'd like to learn more about managing explosive behaviours in children with ADHD, and to order a copy of Sarah's new book, Raising Attention, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at All Aboard ADHD. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard wherever you're listening today, to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.